Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this second presentation of our short series on COVID-19 in historical perspective, organized by the PhD doctorate in history of art and archaeology of the University of Genoa, and the Centra, the Center for the History of Racism and Anti-Racism in Modern Italy. It's really a pleasure for me to have the chance to present this relevant book titled "I Know Who Caused COVID-19: Pandemics and Xenophobia." Appeared with Reaction Press and Chicago University Press last year. And I'm thrilled to have here with us the two authors, Professor Sander Gilman and Dr. Xun Zhou. I just would like to introduce the authors before the presentation. Sander Gilman is a distinguished professor emeritus of the liberal arts and sciences, as well as emeritus professor of psychiatry at Emory University. A cultural and literary historian, he is a very prolific author. He's the author of or editor of over 100 books. The most recent probably is what we are going to present today. His most recent edited volume is the Oxford Handbook of Music and the Body, published with Yoon Kim in 2019 with Oxford University Press. He's the author of the basic study of the visual stereotyping of the mentally ill, seeing the insane, a particularly favorite of mine, I would like to say. Published in 1982 and reprinted in 1996 and 2014. As well, the standard study of Jewish self-hatred, the title of its Johns Hopkins University Press monograph of 1986, which is still in print. For 25 years, he was a member of the humanities and medical faculties at Cornell University, where he held the Goldwin-Smith Professorship of Humane Studies. For 6 years, he held the Henry Luce Distinguished Service Professorship of the Liberal Arts in Human Biology at the University of Chicago. For 4 years, he was a distinguished professor of the Liberal Arts and Medicine at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he created the Humanities Laboratory. He has been a visiting professor at a number of universities in North America, South Africa, the United Kingdom, Germany, Israel, China, and New Zealand. Was president of the Modern Language Association in 1995. He has been awarded a Doctor of Law, Doctor Honoris Causa, at the University of Toronto in 1997, elected an honorary professor of the Free University in Berlin, honorary member of the American Psychoanalytic Association, and made a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Xun Zhou is a reader in history at the University of Essex. Currently, she is a fellow of the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin and a visiting scholar at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science. Dr. Zhou is one of Europe's leading historians, media researchers, and analysts specializing on modern China. Author, co-author, and editor of many groundbreaking books, in particular Disease, Religion, and Healing in Asia, published in 2015. Social History of Drug Consumption in Modern China, published in 2004. And The Global History of Smoking, in 2004, and History of Chinese Perceptions of Jews and Judaism, published in 2001. Dr. Zhou is among a growing number of historians who are pioneering the history of PRC using new oral and archival evidence. Based on thousands of archival documents and hundreds of interviews she collected, her documentary and oral history works on the Great Famine in China, 2012 and 2014, are powerful accounts which have helped to reshape our understanding of modern Chinese history. Dr. Zhou has recently been elected a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society in the UK in recognition of her contribution to historical scholarship. Her recent books are, of course, I Know Cause COVID-19, and I would like to quote this other book, The People Health Intervention and Delivery in Mao, China, 1949-1983, published with McGill Queen University in 2020. As part of the European Commission Research Executive Agency funded project. Dr. Zhou has also a long track record in media activities. Some of her interviews amongst famine survivors have appeared in the award-winning French documentary film Mao's Great Famine. And between 2012 and 2013, Dr. Zhou also wrote a regular op-ed column for the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong. In the beginning of the COVID pandemic in 2020, Dr. Zhou was regularly interviewed by major news media such as the New York Times and BBC to comment on the COVID-19 crisis, of course, in China. I'm thrilled to have Sandra and Xun here. In a short passage of the book we are going to introduce, which is a passage which is a quotation, I think, of Charles Rosenberg's very famous article on AIDS. We can read, whether a pandemic ends in a bang or a whimper, it is always followed by amnesia. This is a very interesting passage, I think, because we are actually experiencing right now this kind of strange amnesia. I think that this presentation is an attempt to react against this process of amnesia. So I'm delighted to have you here, to have the possibility, the chance to discuss your book. I would like to leave the floor, first of all, to Dr. Xun and then to Professor Sandra Gilman. Thank you, and the floor is yours, Xun. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca, for the kind introduction, and thank you for everyone for being here. As you heard, that I'm a historian, and I understand some of you here are also historians. And starting with Thucydides, historians has always been interested in epidemics. For a historian, a pandemic or epidemic is as much a social phenomenon as it is a biological one. And this can be seen through the lens in how communities responded to it. In so many ways, the COVID pandemic we have experienced and are still experiencing, it's not finished yet, is unique in its own way or never before experienced, as many would say. Yet, I would also argue that it is a very traditional phenomenon. To give you an example, in his account of Plague of Athens, Thucydides showed us that human irrational response were a permanent reaction to catastrophe. We certainly see plenty of that this time around. Okay, since Francesco had kind of quoted Charles Rosenberg, the historian of medicine, Charles Rosenberg, compared a pandemic to a human drama. It has a beginning and an end. And in the beginning, or the act one of a pandemic, this text came from Camus' 1947 novel. It's called The Pest, or translated as The Plague, which was set in French Algeria, the town of Oran. Yes, so in the beginning, the doctor in Camus' novel, like the doctor in Camus' novel, most authorities are slow to accept and acknowledge a major disease outbreak because acknowledgement would threaten political legitimacy and economic interests. At the same time, admitting the presence of major disease outbreak would run the risk of social dissolution. And this is exactly what happened during the initial outbreak in Wuhan in central China more than 2 years ago. And I would argue that this is not unique in China. Many other governments, in the West, here in Europe and in the United States, reacted in the exactly same way. So let us for a moment turn to what happened in Wuhan between early December 2019 and the early January 2020, this graph, I'm terrible, I'm a historian, I'm terrible with graph, so I downloaded this one from Gemma. As you can see, that in early December, actually, the first case recorded was on the 8th of December 2019. Yeah, doctors in various hospitals in Wuhan began treating cluster patients stricken with a mysterious pneumonia. At the time, they didn't have a name. And today in China, it's still called new pneumonia. COVID-19, in China, is still called pneumonia. So these early cases were recorded, and reporting was supposed to have been done automatically through a very high-tech internet reporting system. Remember that after the SARS pandemic, the Chinese authority, had updated its, disease surveillance system and reporting system. But the reporting was not, this automatic reporting system, yeah, but this is not what actually happened during the current pandemic, in the initial stage of the pandemic. So like, I'm going back to Camus for a bit. So like the dead rat in Camus' novel, it was kicked to a side by a certain local doctor, Bernard Richoux. And in this case, the local authority in Hubei province. We are told that over a political aversion to sharing bad news, they withhold information about cases from the national reporting system. So, yeah, here it was only until the last day of 2019, 3 weeks had passed by. It turned out to be a machine translation of a Chinese media report about outbreak of new pneumonia in Wuhan was posted to a US-based open access platform for early intelligence about infectious disease outbreak. And the WHO headquarters in Geneva saw the post. And then they instructed the WHO China country office to request verification of the outbreak from authorities in China. It was only until then Wuhan Municipal Health Commission issued its first public statement on the outbreak, acknowledging it has identified 27 cases. This is interesting. I was in China for Christmas, and it was a few days before. It was actually on Boxing Day. I have learned about something awful going on in Wuhan. This awful disease in Wuhan on Boxing Day through a Chinese social media, but that was quickly shut down the information, and those doctors who raised the alarm, such as Dr. Li Wenliang, were silenced, and sadly he died of infection. So, okay, so now the Chinese authority finally acknowledged there was some outbreak of strange disease going on in Wuhan, and yet even after the Chinese CDC got involved, authorities in Hubei province continue to set narrow criteria for confirming cases, leaving out crucial information that could provide clues that the virus was actually spreading among humans. In the meantime, in Wuhan, there were several super spread events taking place, including a local party congress and New Year banquets. Several New Year banquets attended by thousands of people. Interestingly, Taiwan, because of the long-term political distrust between China and Taiwan, when the Taiwan authority received this information from the WHO, it didn't trust the official information from the PRC, from China, whereas WHO did. So interestingly, so the Taiwan authority immediately contacts their private contacts in China to try to get as much information as they could. In the meantime, they advised the Taiwan citizens in Taiwan, not to go to mainland, because many of them go to mainland for business. So the authority advised these, people not to go into mainland, and they also introduced the testing at the airports. And they, from there on, they also communicated with the citizens on television every night to try to, warning the public about the seriousness of the situation. So, Taiwan had because Taiwan had acted very early, Taiwan did not wait for the WHO's instruction. So Taiwan, as most of you know, Taiwan came out really well, during the current pandemic. So let's go back to China. Go back a little bit, kind of why this political version, kind of trying to hold information, trying to hide, kind of lack of transparency. So in China, historically, epidemic, war, and natural disasters have been seen as singularly the loss of the mandate of heaven, which led to the downfall of many dynasties. So after the Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1949, it made eradicating diseases and improving the health of the entire population a central pillar of its policies. It was also promised, sold to the people in China. On the other hand, so the failure to control a epidemic could cost the Communist Party its political legitimacy. That's why the Chinese authority has constantly shown reluctance or lack of transparency in acknowledging any disease outbreaks threatening to the public's health. So now, kind of the authority has finally acknowledged the danger. Then we turn to what Charles Rosenberg calls Act 2 of the pandemic. So back in January 2020, having finally acknowledged the danger, in Act 2 is to dispel it through a collective exorcism that involves identifying who was at the fault. Yeah. So during the plague of Athens, I'm keep on going back, kind of forward a little bit. So during the plague of Athens, the blame, as we learn from Thucydides, the blame first fell on the Africans. And in medieval Europe, it was the Jews who were blamed for poisoning the well and spread the plague. And in the 19th century, the Chinese immigrants in the west coast of the United States and in Canada were blamed for causing a serious epidemics of smallpox, which I shall turn to a little bit later in my talk. So one of the repeating features of all epidemics, as you see, is someone always gets blamed, and it's often the poor outgroups. Anthropologist Mary Douglas noted years ago, the fear of danger tends to strengthen the lines of division in a community. If that is so, the response to a major crisis digs more deeply the cleavage that have been there all the time. And this will mean that if there is big inequality of wealth, the poor will suffer more than if the distribution were more equitable. And if there is a violent xenophobia, the foreigners will be blamed and programmed more. So back in January 2020, back in China, capitalizing on growing anxiety in the West over the loss of wildlife. And China, quite often, it's been blamed, has attracted lots of criticism for, been blamed for consuming and trading wild animals. And the authority had turned this around, in China, turned this around. And so they first placed the blame on the poor migrant vendors working in Wuhan's Huanan Safety Market. If you followed the major media, you know, kind of this name, Huanan Safety Market, was familiar, although I think most people had kind of forget about it right now. So okay, so the claim was the virus had jumped, and it happened in the seafood market, But interestingly, there's only a very small number of vendors working in the markets were infected compared to a much larger cluster of infection throughout the city, and the cases were detected in the seafood market were much later, kind of, whereas, as I showed earlier, the first case was in fact actually, kind of recorded in the early December. And now, kind of, we also have the data which shows that no wild animals on sale in Wuhan's, not just only Huanan Safety Market, but kind of markets all over Wuhan. None of the wild animals on sale actually carried SARS-CoV-2. But nevertheless, on the first day of 2020, authorities in Hubei province proceeded to shutting down and disinfect the markets. And this echoed the debates concerning the origin of SARS infection in 2003, seen as stemming from consumption of flesh of wild animals, and which led to the closing of virtually all the open-air markets in Hong Kong and the imposition of Western standard of hygiene by moving the vendors into a purposely built sort of parking garage-like, kind of place, and where, kind of spread like this become a daily ritual. And so this is also the case in mainland China ever since SARS epidemic. And to prepare for the next big public health emergency, one would often see public health, I call them stormtroopers, kind of armed with backpacks filled with disinfectant, searching for epidemics to prevent, but not people to save. So eventually on January the 4th, the WHO posted issued its first public statement on the outbreak in a tweet on January 4th, 2020. In the meantime, there's very little been done, and there was a hesitation, kind of WHO, and as many of you remember, that hesitate of declaring a pandemic. And 2 weeks had passed by in the meantime, and the Chinese New Year was approaching, when millions would be on the move, potentially spread the virus across the entire country and even beyond the Chinese border, across the globe. Until then, the central authority in Beijing grasped that the failure to control the spread could cost the Chinese Communist Party's political legitimacy and equally damage China's global image. It quickly launched a political campaign to combat the disease. China's highest political body, the Central Political and Legal Affairs Commission, not the CDC or the Health Commission, gave order to lock down Wuhan, the mega city of 11 million. So lockdown provided a feared yet politically compelling administrative option. Those disputed, troublesome border regions, such as Xinjiang in the northwest and Yunnan in the southwest, where systematic oppression of minority ethnic groups, such as the Uyghur Muslims, had already begun in earnest well in advance of the outbreak in Wuhan. The COVID-19 has provided justification for increasing police power. As of April 2020, as Wuhan and other Chinese cities began to gradually emerge from the lockdown, and in the meantime, the crisis in Europe and United States was growing worse, the official narrative in China would start to claim that the virus was actually imported into the country from the outside, either via the frozen food chain or by returning Muslim pilgrims or other foreigners. So the official discourse fueled a popular racism in China in the southern city of Guangzhou, where there is a large presence of African population. Racism, racism against people of color, particularly the black people, but also Muslim from Southeast Asia, began to increase. Of course, this is not unique in China. History is full of examples when governments or authority with power and privilege imposing interventions on people without power or privilege. It often fuels social conflicts. So going back into history a little bit, in the 19th century, take British, for example, the British engagement in India spread many of what has been local epidemics, such as cholera, across the world and threatening European cities. It was, however, the non-white bodies of Asia were blamed as the source of the disease as well as agent for spreading the disease. So this text is from Orissa. Orissa is by the British historian and civil servant working in India, William Hunter. In this text, as you can see in front of you, William Hunter identified Hindu and Muslim pogroms being the most powerful of, I quote here, yeah, the most powerful of all causes which conduced to development and propagation of cholera epidemics. And their carelessness, this is Hunter's words, their carelessness not only endangered their own life, but more importantly, imperils life far more valuable than their own. May any year slay thousands, the most talented and the most beautiful of our age, in Vienna, London, or Washington. And this text by Hunter established one of the earliest global health maps that in it, certain groups of people, almost always the non-white bodies, were blamed for being responsible for spread of devastating diseases across the world. And the cholera pandemic that swept across the world in the 19th century would lead to the signature of the Sanitary Convention on April 15, 1893, when 19 European powers met in Dresden, which is not far, 1 hour from where I live now in Berlin. So these documents you can see here was signed at the convention, which singled out certain categories of people such as gypsies, migrants, and immigrants for controlling of infectious diseases. And back in the British India, to control cholera, Indian Muslim pilgrims were subjugated to prolonged and humiliating periods of quarantine, and the administration of draconian colonial public health measures fostered systematic tensions between Hindu and Muslim communities in the Ganges Delta region. And by the turn of the 21st century, fast forward, yeah, with the radicalization of Islam in South Asia and Hindu nationalism, the racist language and attitudes of the early colonial power re-emerged with a certain viciousness. In April 2020, during the current pandemic, after the meeting of the Muslim Missionary Society in Delhi led a COVID outbreak, Hindu nationalists blamed all Muslims for the virus. Around the world, early in the pandemic, the Muslim pilgrims, like in China, were blamed for spreading the disease after the Chinese had supposedly contained it. So as the COVID pandemic progressed, Saudi Arabia banned Muslim pilgrims from outside the country to go to Mecca and Medina to perform Hajj, one of the basic tenets of Muslim life. So as you can see, the mosque is left empty. And in the West, guess what? The blame has fallen on the Chinese, surprisingly, or not surprising. And more broadly, these Chinese also include anyone who looks, kind of Chinese or the Oriental. The term, was used in the media. The Oriental. As we have learned that early in early on, this is of course another traditional trope. Yeah, it is well known that in the last quarter of the 19th century, Chinese immigrants living in the Pacific coast of the United States and Canada were regularly used as a medical scapegoat by local health officials for the failure of their own sanitary program. And they blamed all epidemic outbreaks to the crowding living condition of the Chinese and their primitive unclean habits. Yeah, inverted commas. And this text in front of you is from the State Secretary of Canada. He compared Vancouver's Chinatown to an, I quote here, an ulcer lodged like a piece of wood in the tissues of the human body, which, unless treated, must cause disease in the places around it and ultimately to the whole body. So the Chinese were dangerous. In the United States, a series of epidemic of smallpox in the 1870s and the bubonic plague in the 1900s in San Francisco were used by the authorities to justify the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Acts. Okay, fast forward to late January 2020, American public health authorities first labeled COVID-19 the Wuhan virus, and by tracing the origin of the disease to the overcrowding of this Chinese city and the cities, the term was the dark, damp, and filthy seafood markets, as well as the Chinese despicable habits of consuming and trading in wild animals. You see this, the very same sort of 19th century rhetoric, which was built on the then new science of race, was brought back to life in the 21st century. And as the United States and China's trade deal faded into, faded into failure and thus obscurity, and the pandemic decimated the American economy, Trump, who early on had praised the Chinese authority for controlling the disease, now loudly blamed the Chinese government for the spread of what he calls the China virus or Kung Fu flu. And globally, as a variety of interests intersected the horror of the pandemic in different contexts, China were labeled as the patient zero. In the United States and in Europe, official discourse in turn fueled racist and xenophobic violence attacking population of Chinese or Asian or Southeast Asian heritage. In San Francisco, attacks on Chinese Americans have spiked since the late January, and these these two photos were taken in the aftermath of one Chinese shop being attacked. And in the UK, according to the Metropolitan Police data, 21 attacks against Orientals, that was the term used, were recorded in January 2020. And this rose steeply as the pandemic continued, reaching 50 incidents in the summer 2020. As Lu Gan, he is a global health researcher at the University College in London. As he puts it, he's of Chinese heritage, and as he puts it, it feels like the atmosphere after 9/11 towards Muslim, when any Muslim on the street was seen as a potential terrorist. Now it's any Chinese is a potential existential threat to civilization. Note here that any Chinese does not mean your Chinese neighbor next door, but the Chinese as their outgroup, a collective. As our new book shows, that pandemic caused people as individuals and as a member of a collective to be blamed for something over which they have little or no control. Older models of stigmatization reappear as means of limiting and relocating the observer's invalid, if inchoate, fear. And the outgroup, however, can shift from moment to moment and from location to location. As you have heard earlier, for the Hindu nationalists in India, the outgroup was Muslims. In the UK, the so-called Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities, short for BAME, were not object of blame or attack for causing the pandemic. They have, however, been singled out for being the victim of the COVID pandemic. And being the victim, they also were seen as for spreading the disease. So their marginalization alienates them further, making them more hesitant or even resisting in participating in the official public health projects such as vaccination. Sorry, I had made a mistake with the order of my slides. So I'm going to, the anthropologist, medical anthropologist David Lapierre argues forcefully, we are all in this together, rings hollow when so many feels we are not. I think I'm just going to end my part of the talk here. I'm going to hand it over to Sander, and we will take questions after Sander speaking. Thank you very much for your patient attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So Sander, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Those of you who have been attentive to the news have noticed that the focus is no longer on COVID-19. It's very much on Ukraine. I was invited, a year and a half ago to give a talk on the instrumentalization of the Holocaust in the present moment, and accepted the invitation. I'm going to speak in June in Berlin, accepted the invitation because we had written about this question of the Holocaust and its instrumentalization in our book, and I thought to myself, it's an easy talk to give. About 3 weeks ago, I got an email from my colleague who organized this conference in Berlin saying, the floor has shifted. The Holocaust is only of interest now in regards to Putin's evocation of the Holocaust and the Nazis as a rationalization, and Zelensky's response by accusing the Russians of being, in point of fact, committing genocide. All interest in COVID disappeared, a total amnesia in the public sphere. Now, in our book, what we did, and Xun gave us a wonderful case study of this, is to look at what we used to call meta-narratives. Jean-François Leotard in the 1960s developed the notions that we have stories that we tell in society, and because historians are part of society, in the writing of history, which focus not on facts, but use facts as a way of talking about the underlying emotional response to events. History is a fiction, Leotard gestured, that we invent to persuade ourselves that events are knowable and that life has order and direction from our perspective. Now, Xun gestured, of course, at the narrative, right? That of Thucydides and the history of the Peloponnesian War. Now, in the 5th century, as you remember from your school, the war between Athens and Sparta basically destroyed Athenian power. It became, in the West, the way we talk about plague. It was a plague which simultaneously took place during war, right? Whether it's Afghanistan or Ukraine. It's a plague that took place during natural disasters. There were immense numbers of earthquakes, proof about the gods' anger on the Peloponnese, and suddenly plague. Plague was in a sense, the cherry on the sundae to prove this concatenation of things. And the response by the Athenians, as Xun noted, was to do two things. And Thucydides is a great index of this. First of all, he said, I'm going to tell you about the plague. I'm going to tell you about the plague because I had the plague. And then he tells about the course of the illness, the symptoms of the illness, what happened to him. That's not sufficient because his contemporaries in Athens want to know who did it and why they did it, right? So first of all, he said, look, the people in Piraeus, right, these hicks in the port, think that people came in and poisoned the wells. The Spartans came in and poisoned the wells because there were no public fountains in Piraeus. So, and that's silly. But he says, the disease began, and this is the really important phrase. The disease began, it is said, in Ethiopia beyond Egypt, and then descended into Egypt and Libya and spread over the greater part of the king's territory. I'm not saying this. It is said, they say, it is claimed on the internet. They say it started over there. And as Xun pointed out, this is a central trope. We don't blame ourselves, we blame somebody else. The political response, the great Athenian leader Pericles basically said, don't be scared, don't be scared. I know you're upset about the plague. I realize that Athens has a mighty name among all mankind because she has never yielded to misfortune, he says, but more freely than any other city has lavished lives and labors upon war, and that she possesses today a power which is the greatest that ever existed down to our time. We must, in spite of earthquakes and plague and war, we must make Athens great again. Mega. And then, of course, Pericles dies of the plague. The difficulty that we have, and that's, of course, the central difficulty, is understanding that this moment in Athens causes unbelievable social havoc. Thucydides notes that the plague first introduced into the city a greater lawlessness. For whether men used to practice concealment, they were now not acting purely after their pleasure. They now showed a more careless daring. No fear of gods or law of men restrained people. So they just acted out. Now, Thucydides has a theory of history. He thinks that history can get really bad, but it rights itself, right? These are extreme moments. We have extreme collapse of social mores, but eventually we go back to the normal. The normal maybe being the act of forgetting. Now, I want to move forward to the 17th century, because in the 17th century, Thucydides is translated into English. 1629, Thomas Hobbes' translation of Thucydides appears. Now, again, as with Thucydides, we remember Hobbes from a single phrase, that our lives were solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Only government can save us from the collapse, which is what we are. If we let people go, in opposition to Thucydides, people will act against their collective interests and for their individual interests. Now, plague is central to this. And if you look at the frontispiece of Hobbes' Leviathan, right, in 1651, one of the things you do is you see an empty street with two people walking on the empty street, two plague doctors in full PPE of the time. Now, Hobbes doesn't like liberty, right? He thinks that unfettered action of human beings living in the state of nature is destructive of the collective. If we do not have power, and this is very much opposite to Thucydides, power controls our base nature. Hobbes argues there is a perpetual war of every man against his neighbor, no inheritance to transmit to the son, not to expect from the father, no propriety of goods or lands, no security. Now, the difference between Hobbes's Thucydides and Thucydides' Athens, right, is the fact that when in the Great Plague, right, of the 17th century, a plague which was what? Not only a plague, but occurred during war, civil war in England, and of course, natural disasters, the Great Fire of London, which burned down most of London. People started to look for a cause, right? Everybody knew, in a sense, who caused the Great Fire. They blamed the Catholics. That was easy. But when the House of Commons had a debate about the cause of the plague, they argued it was the atheists who were undermining the rule of the divine, much by the way as Thucydides sees these divine actions as the cause of plague. And who do they blame? Well, the only person who gets mentioned in the debate is Thomas Hobbes. Now, that notion is really important because Hobbesian notions of the state come to dominate, right? This isn't Thucydides, we're going to have a problem and everything is going to get better. This is, in point of fact, Hobbes's world. We live in Hobbes's world. British law, black letter law, summarized by William Blackstone in the 18th century, argues that it is the state's obligation to control plague, right? He says that those infected with plague may be enforced by the watchman appointed on such melancholy occasions to be locked in their homes. And if they are locked in their homes and they go out, they should be whipped as a vagabond. And if he's sick and he goes out, he should be guilty of a felony and hung. So if you don't die of the plague, you're going to get hung for going out of your house. Not quite what we argue today, but almost. Now, what's really important for us to understand is that we live in an age in which the state has now taken on, as Xun talks about with Mao's China, the obligation to control epidemic. That is one of the things that the state, following Hobbes and the notion of British common law, has. It is a natural claim of the state. Pace Benedict Anderson, right? Remember Anderson in Imagined Communities argues there's certain symbolic registers that define the modern state, right? And he talks about skin color, gender, parentage, birth era, right? So-called natural ties. Health is one of them. Health is one of them. So we have to then rethink Isaiah Berlin's definition of negative freedom from state control to freedom to act. Because what, of course, Berlin is looking at is Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, which he had escaped from in the 1920s. He wasn't looking at public health. And in the beginning of the COVID pandemic, there was a real debate about the ability to control, right? Control the pandemic through mass public health regulations. And then, by the way, the beginning of 2021, through vaccination. Who wins? Well, that is, of course, where we are now. We are in this moment of anti-vaxxing amnesia. Everything is fine. It always was fine. There was never a problem. It was state overreach. But in point of fact, that moment of amnesia, that forgetting the need to control, is something which Hobbes warned us about. Because, and we're seeing this, of course, how the anti-vaxxing movement and the far right wing, and by the way, the far left wing doing the same thing, become allied in opposition to present state power. Not, by the way, in terms of their ability to control the world. If they ran the world, everything would be better. But in terms of the present arrangement of state power, which foregrounds public health, but foregrounds a whole bunch of other things that they have folded into the arguments about state control in the 21st century. Now, Xun gestured at something which is quite important, and I want to sort of talk about this, which is what happens when groups who are traditionally stereotyped actually are part of the problem. Now, I'll be anecdotal for a moment. I was very much involved in the 1980s in the HIV/AIDS questions, right? And I was part of a group that was strongly advocating for changes in social activity, right? Condom use, rubber dam use. The whole notion was that one had to have the equivalent of masks. I was, of course, immediately shouted down, because what the argument was, we gay people, we people who use intravenous drugs, have always been stereotyped. We are always seen as the source of the problem. And now you want us to accept being the source of the problem and change who we are. What we want, and this was, of course, argument against Dr. Fauci in the 1980s, who was called, of course, a Nazi, was that we wanted behavioral change. What many people in the gay community want was an instantaneous vaccine, which even today has not happened. What happened, of course, is that people changed their behavior. People changed their behavior. And so one of the things we have to argue is that there is a problem between accepting responsibility as a member of a group that is transmitting because of their actions in the world, the virus, and those who see those traditional social mores as needing reform. I am talking now about responsibility, not culpability. There's a big difference. Responsibility is doing what you've always done and now having negative outcomes. Culpability is undertaking things that you know will cause damage, right? And for which you act knowing that it's going to cause damage. That's the double bind that our book describes, and describes in great detail. The Jewish community, the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, is the key example, right? The ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, Jews in general, as Xun pointed out, from the plague of the 14th century on, have been blamed for spreading disease. The Nazi used that image of the Jews as rats invading Europe and spreading their poison. This is nothing new. But the Haredi community in the United States, in Israel, in the UK, and in South America, because of social practice, had an immensely high rate of infection. And because they are an incredibly mobile international community, right? People move regularly from New York to Jerusalem to London to Buenos Aires. They also were responsible for spreading the virus. And the death rates in that community are incredibly high. Now, these communities, by the way, are not homogeneous. They're radically different groups that we lump under ultra-Orthodox. But in point of fact, all of them had higher local rates of infection from the beginning of the pandemic on, higher rates of reinfection, higher rates of hospitalization, and higher rates of death. Not because they were being stereotyped. Now, people then tried to say, why? Why does this group have these very high rates of infection? One explanation was social structure, right? Social structure meaning the practices that they had. They gathered together in study centers. They have mass celebrations. There was a very early on in the pandemic in Israel, the death of a beloved rabbi from COVID, and the funeral was attended by tens of thousands of unmasked people, right? So social structure was looked at. There was a critique of the leadership in this community, and that's absolutely true. For the very first time in the history of the state of Israel, the ultra-Orthodox rabbinate urged people to violate public health norms. That had never happened before. Now, many of them changed their minds as the pandemic became worse and worse and worse. The initial argument was, we'll pray our way out of this. What happens, of course, very quickly is that it was clear that this was going to be a major problem, and no one was going to pray their way out of it. One of the arguments, and it's an argument used about BAME communities in the UK, African American communities in the US, is that these are communities that are very poor, and they are very poor. The men often study rather than work. They rely on public assistance in the United States and in Israel. And they have a much higher rate of, can we say, communal living. They live in smaller areas with larger families. The difficulty is that the state, certainly in Israel and in the United States, that is kind of true, but analogous communities in Israel, the Israeli Arabs, for example, did not have the same rate of spread, right? And poverty, by the way, it's a very complicated question. You're poor only if you think that you're poor, right? That becomes an interesting question about how do you use these categories for social analysis, right? The argument that was used within the Haredi community over and over and over again is that we're being picked on. You guys are saying nasty stuff about us, right? But because we're being picked on. Now, that becomes now a really interesting problem for analysis, right? For us as historians. How do we think about these communities both as victims and as perpetrators? Now, I'm going to make an argument that all communities, I'm going back obviously to Ben Anderson, constitute themselves out of symbolic orders. One element is health and illness. Communities which define themselves as beyond public health limits, God will allow us to pray ourselves out of this. Thucydides argues that in an odd way, right? Hobbes argues that in an odd way. See then the externalization. We are not at fault, right? Because we're doing all the things that our symbolic order permits, even though in doing that, we, in point of fact, are responsible for higher rates of infection, hospitalization, and death. Certainly, and this is where the debates in the right wing today become really important, is that the dichotomy then becomes health and illness versus what? Religious freedom, individual freedom, a kind of Isaiah Berlinish freedom from state control rather than a Hobbesian need for state control. And the leadership, and Trump was a very good example, but we can think of other leaders on the far right, becomes a kind of free-floating signifier in which all of these debates about plague, epidemic, pandemic gets folded into other social, political causes. The state becomes the thing to blame. And it's interesting to me that Trump, who is now out of power, kind of course, immediately now blames Biden for the spread of the pandemic rather than taking responsibility. So the ultra-Orthodox Jews, the Haredis, then become both insiders and outsiders simultaneously. And I'm going to make an argument that that is, of course, the real problem that COVID-19 has confronted us with. The problem is not who is at fault, but how do we both as members of communities and then members of the greater public, right, of the public sphere, think about placing blame but also placing responsibility. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Sander. Thank you, Xun. We have time. We have half an hour, I think, for a discussion, for questions. You know how it works. You have to raise the hand. If you like, I can start with a couple of questions to both the participants, but we have Guri Schwarz, and one you can start first if you like, Guri.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, thanks to both authors for the book and for the insightful presentations. I was thinking about this when you were speaking. Professor Gilman mentioned Leotard and the concept of meta-narratives, and if I remember correctly, Leotard's argument was that he was believing that in the postmodern condition, meta-narratives would decline, would enter a crisis. What we've seen is exactly the opposite. We've seen the triumph of various kind of meta-narratives, both from the state, who has to promote public health measures, going from lockdowns to vaccinations and so on and so forth, as well as from opponents of these policies who also promoted other kinds of powerful meta-narratives. I think, for example, the employment of Holocaust analogies from anti-vaxxers is, of course, a powerful meta-narrative in itself. So I was wondering if you could expand on this issue, because I think what we've gone through is actually an interesting clash of and the return to a certain degree of powerful meta-narratives in our time.
I had a public debate with Leotard about this at Irvine in the must have been late 70s, early 80s. Because again, what is interesting about postmodern theory, and it was my problem with Foucault too, is that there was a kind of sense, and I'm going to be very careful what I'm saying, a kind of sense of progress built into postmodernism.
Yeah.
Right? And it's again, I can do this in detail. I don't want to. This is not the place to do this. But what I said to Leotard was, because we were talking at that point also about meta-history, right, was that we do have these kind of central tropes which we fall back on, And one of the things that has been, for me, very interesting is that one of the big claims in the late 20th century was that the ability of everybody to write history, right? World Wide Web, everybody's a historian, was going to enable us to undermine meta-narratives. And because I am an inherent pessimist, I apologize, I'm an inherent pessimist. What I said was exactly the opposite's going to happen, which is, in order to sound historical, what we do is we drag up the meta-narrative structures which we all have in here and which seem to be kind of real, right? The Holocaust is real, even though the Holocaust we're talking about is not 1941 to 1945, the murder of 9 million people in camps. What we're talking about is our collective understanding, fantasy, and imagery. By the way, imagery which is almost all post-1945, which could then be dragged out and used, right? And it struck me in doing this book with Xun, because the cases that we looked at, and I'll stop at that point, we looked at obviously China and what I call the diasporic Chinese, that is the Orientals outside of China. We looked at ultra-Orthodox Jews. We looked at African Americans and BAME. minority communities in the UK and the US. We looked at the right wing because they constituted themselves also as a community that thought of themselves what? As victims and as perpetrators. So it was, it kind of proved to me that my argument against Leotard, my argument against Foucault, was that no, this is something we have to be attentive to as historians. We have to understand how certain things which seem to be past, fragmentary, always are able to be reused. And that's why I use the Thucydides-Hobbes distinction, because my God, Hobbes is rewriting Thucydides, and we wind up rewriting Hobbes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just add, to what
sure.
Sander says. It's also, kind of history is imagined in a kind of, in the sense that it's always about present. It's not about what happened. Yeah, it's not about Holocaust, as you pointed out. It's about the present. It's where we are now, and kind of, I mean, that's what I wanted to add. Yeah. Sorry,
absolutely. Yes. No, absolutely. Just a couple of questions to both of you. The first one is about the role of images or visual culture in this process of stereotypization, of the construction of the blame on other population, other groups. Professor Gilman talked about his role during the debates on AIDS, and I remember his fantastic book on the representation of disease, which was focused a lot on AIDS. And first of all, we'd like to ask both of you about the relevance of images in the construction of these stereotypes. Wet markets are another interesting example, I think, and we saw photographies of these of the action against wet markets and photography of wet markets, which are completely full of stereotypes of a certain kind of Oriental way of living, etc. So my first question is about images, actually, and the role of images. And the second question is about eugenics, and eugenics in China, in US, in Israel, and the connection between the eugenic project, broadly speaking, that cleansing the national body and improving the health of the national body, on the one hand, and on the other, the construction of otherness, of different kind of otherness through the metaphor of health and illness. Thank you. Xun first.
Sander, why don't you go first, and I will. Why don't you go first?
Okay, I mean,
on the imagery.
The answer is, of course, imagery shortcuts rationality. Now, I'm going to make an argument that rationality is itself not separable from emotions, right? I mean, I'm not saying that, images are more effective, right? But in point of fact, they tend to shortcut that kind of intermediate stage, which seems to be more, quote unquote, rational. It's not, but it seems to be. So I think it's much more immediate. And again, we live in a world which, starting with Gutenberg, right, starting with the broadsides of the Reformation, is ever more saturated with images. And you're absolutely right. I mean, it strikes me again that one of the nice things to do is to look at texts and accompanying pictures, because oftentimes they're in conflict, but you'll be able to, it's in a sense, in an odd way, easier to read the images. And certainly now with COVID, that's been absolutely the case, because we have images of the innocent victims and we have images of the bad perpetrators, the old cliches. So I would agree completely with this. I think that the eugenics project is what I was gesturing at by adding it to Ben Anderson's set of criteria for defining the national state. He talks about the modern state, the post-Enlightenment state, the state at the age of Hobbes, right? I mean, because, Hobbes's England cuts off the king's head. I mean, that's the beginning of modernity. And if the king can't preserve his own head, we know we're in trouble, right? So I think the eugenics project is exactly what we're talking about, and virtually every one of the sites that Xun used talking about the 19th century and Orientals have to do with notions of eugenics, of healthy societies and ill societies, of getting rid of the ill within the healthy societies and forbidding the ill from entering into the healthy societies. Xun?
Very much so, but it also goes back to this, kind of concept of, this question of meta narrative, yeah, and this is certainly the case in the 19th century and the early 20th century. There was this on the left, not right, but this is on the left. There was this need to, reference, for example, the Chinese into this meta narrative. So the Chinese become seen, kind of the images used. There's an image as well. Photography was, remember that photography was just introduced. So you have all these photographs. Yeah, it was a scientific tool. There is a photographs, we have all these photographs of Chinese, the sick body of the Chinese, the sick man of Asia. There's so much those images, And so this become, the representation of the sick body, and so there was for both the Chinese and the the people on the left, there was this need that China needs to be reformed, or China needs to open up for modernization. So one of the things to do is through medical and health, public health interventions, to transform the Chinese body into a healthy body, the diseased body into a healthy body. And food is also involved the Chinese diet. So there was a claim that the Chinese diet was so poor, that contributed to their no intelligence. So they have this modeled mind. The Chinese had the modeled mind, and because of their poor diet, that was the claim. And the unclean habit, the cleanness was discussed over and over again. Their unclean habits, their crowded living condition and look. San Francisco, Chinatown here, there was some photograph. I can't remember the name of this photo essay. There was an album being produced, of San Francisco, Chinatown. It's full of this image of dingy, dark, streets, and the dirty, full of rats. Here, rats come again, and the image of rats, appear in those spaces. And so it's a disease. The Chinese, the diseased body. So the through eugenics, you can breed out those inferior genes. And so, eugenics become part of the national project in China, and China is probably one of the very few countries now still have a eugenic law.
Absolutely, and a very radical one as well.
Yes, very radical one. And so which goes back, all the way to this meta narrative and of the Enlightenment history, the progress. And China is still there. China is so the Chinese government can show how well we've done now. We have to continue. The threat is always there. Don't forget. The threat is present. So the disease is one of the threats. There's so many other things as well. But the threat now is not within. It used to be the Chinese peasantry. That this was also imagined community. the rural population were imagined as Chinese peasantry. They were dirty. They eat, horrible food. They have a horrible diet, and they, they breed in such a way, so they spread the bad seeds, and undermine the quality of the population. So this, with the people, they were described as dirty and stupid. These were the term used, and so they have to be reformed. So when the communists came into power, one of the things it was the communist authority did was and to introduce a cultural reform. Cultural revolution. It's not the cultural revolution, the great proletarian cultural revolution, but actually the term cultural revolution. You have to enlighten these people. You have to educate them. You have to teach them. And so you have to transform their sort of old habit and custom, prevailing, habit and custom through a socialist transformation. So to turn the Chinese countryside, the dirty, diseased Chinese countryside, into a communist paradise, free of disease. These were the term evoked. And now so they have more or less achieved of getting rid of the countryside and made them into cities. And then the problem, the irony is the cities, and become the problem for a disease. So.
Yes, thank you. Very, very interesting point. This one about the contradiction and the relationship between the urban situation and the rural one. We have time to 5-6 minutes for questions, for other questions. Just raise your hand if you like. Don't be shy. Yes, Guri.
No, if no one else is speaking,
it's a game between me and you.
I have a lot of questions. I mean, I found
too,
really the book insightful and very interesting, and I think this is just a very, very broad question. I think it would be interesting for our students if you briefly reference the final part of the book in which you discuss Trump's attitude towards the pandemic, because I think there are a series of issues connected to what we talked about, but very, very interesting for us to look at from a non-American context, but with some similarities in some ways. So mine was just an invitation, to briefly illustrate that part, if you wish.
Well, the book ends by asking the big questions, which is, how do we deal both as historians and, I would argue, in the public sphere, with the memory of fear, death in times of pandemic. And I mean, this is, of course, a commonplace, which was that one of the extraordinary things that happened in the 1920s, right? So you've got the First World War. An entire generation of young men are massacred, which means a whole generation of young women have no life partners. You've got complete social disruption in Europe, right? Austro-Hungarian Empire disappears, the Wilhelminian Empire disappears, France transforms itself politically. And of course, I use the "and" here as the operative word, and of course, you've got the influence of the so-called Spanish flu that winds up killing more people than the war does, right? And then comes the 1920s, and there is an incredible amount of social structure in Weimar Germany, in early socialist Austria, in Great Britain, in the United States, and so forth and so on, dealing with the results of the war, including the social results of the war, right? women, for example, enter into the marketplace. They become a factor in labor in the 1920s, as they had never been before, because there are lots of women who have to earn a living. But the same moment, people completely forget the influenza. It disappears. And it disappears in a way which in retrospect is eerie. And now, of course, starting about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, people have started to say, wait a minute. Everybody talks about the Great War. There are dozens of great books that have been written by historians of the 1980s and 90s about the impact of the Great War on literature and culture and politics. And many people arguing that the Second World War is just the second part of the First World War. Nobody until the late 20th century starts to look at pandemics. And what I do, and what we both do in that last chapter, is to say, yeah, but we've got a kind of a history of that. Maybe starting with Thucydides, but certainly starting in the 20th century, where you've got mass media, where you've got the yellow journalism, where you've got radio and television and the cinema, where you've got mass as well as popular culture. And what the question really is, do we see patterns of dealing with the complexity, or does every single event wind up, again, bringing these tiny little fragments from the past, right? This act of forgetting that Nietzsche talks about is the quotidian way that we have to live our daily life, right? Right? We have this kind of historical fragments floating around in our culture, in our communities. Do we bring that back every single time? And does that also result in, that's the fear that we all have, in a kind of a chaos, which is unrecognized as the result of the pandemic, but in which we may be living right now, so that maybe Ukraine and COVID are not separate issues here.
Thank you.
I think one of the other things emerged from the Great Influenza, sort of, kind of in the, so immediately in the 1920s, this is happening again this time, is to move away from, come to the pandemic, but there was these movements, standard notes of the social medicine, which had already started, and it become very popular, kind of widespread, and which kind of went as far as China. China become a laboratory of implementing this social medicine program, but it's very, kind of popular it's very widespread in Eastern Europe. And the argument, and this argument came, social medicine argument came back over and again in different stages, also in post-war, post-Second World War as well. And it's not the disease, but it's the social-economic condition.
Yeah.
And so this social uplifting, what's here, the term was Mussolini's term. What was I just lost it. The term which translates into social uplifting, bono. Sorry, Francesco.
Bonifica.
Yeah.
The reclamation.
Yes, that was one of the programs. Yeah, it was used, kind of as, kind of was one of the things introduced. I mean, kind of, I know that, in post-war world, and this was the WHO had advocated it. It turns out that the consequences of it is disastrous. Yeah, it has, kind of, and I can see this kind of argument is coming back again. Yeah, so quickly, kind of the pandemic is being kind of it's forgetting what actually the pandemic, but kind of it's this kind of thing, kind of we have so through other kind of social engineering, and then and will ultimately, kind of end all pandemic. So it's the end solution.
Yeah, progress.
Yeah, progress. Here it
Progress.
goes back
Progress.
again. Yeah, go back
Progress.
to progress. So there will be no disease. There will be no more disease. Kind of then we don't have to worry about it. So you can forget about wearing your mask. Yeah, or even vaccine.
But it's, I mean, the thing that we talk about also, is we talk about state actors. Xun has talked about that. We talk about state actors. We talk about individual freedom and the notion that we have rights, but we always forget the actual third party in our conversation. That's the microbe. The microbe has agency. We forget that the microbe has agency. If we have agency, if the state has agency, the microbe has agency.
Yeah.
It has a real path that it wants to follow. And we constantly forget that when we talk about things like social engineering. And of course, that's why now we are in the second wave of tuberculosis and syphilis, which are untreatable with antibiotics.
Or the vector. Yeah, sorry, Sandra.
No,
it's just
go ahead, Xun.
The term was bonification. Yeah, that was the term. But and then the other thing added to you, microbe has agencies, just like mosquitoes and snails. Yeah, they keep on coming back. You can't rid of them. They have then they become resistant. Just as soon as we introduce some kind of intervention, then after a few years they develop resistance, then come back to haunt us again.
Vectors. Yeah, and there, I mean, if I began with Leotard, maybe we end with Leotard, which is that the pessimist in me says that we are always fighting these wars. The optimist in me says that we're aware that we're always fighting these wars.
Yeah. I'm Francesco. I'm sorry.
I know. But I think
so. I have to go.
Yeah, and no problem. I think we can stop on this quite dystopic note. I think that it's a good point. I think that I would like to thank you, both of you. Thank you so much for this presentation and for your book. And the book is important, and I invite you all to read the book. The pandemic is not over, and this book is reading this book is what we can, as historians as well, do in order to understand what is going on and what probably will happen in the future. Right? Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Yeah.
Thank you all for attending this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.